Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 226. Chapter 226. Absolute continuity of motion is not comprehensible to the human mind. Laws of motion of any kind become comprehensible to man only when he examines arbitrarily selected elements of that motion. But at the same time, a large proportion of human error comes from the arbitrary divisions of continuous motion into discontinuous elements. There is a well-known so-called sophism of the ancients, consisting in this, that Achilles could never catch up with the tortoise he was following, in spite of the fact that he traveled 10 times as fast as the tortoise. By the time Achilles has covered the distance that separated him from the tortoise has covered 1/10 of that distance ahead of him. When Achilles has covered that 10th, the tortoise has covered another 100th, and so on forever. This problem seemed to the ancients insoluble. The absurd answer, that Achilles could never overtake the tortoise, resulted from this, that motion was arbitrarily divided into a discontinuous element, whereas the motion of both Achilles and of the tortoise was continuous. By adopting smaller and smaller elements of motion, we only approach a solution to the problem, but never reach it. Only when we have admitted the conception of the infinitely small and the resulting geometrical progression with a common ratio of 1/10, and have found the sum of this progression to infinity, do we reach a solution of the problem. A modern branch of mathematics, having achieved the art of dealing with the infinitely small, can now yield solutions and other more complex problems of motion, which used to appear insoluble. This modern branch of mathematics, unknown to the ancients, when dealing with problems of motion, admits the conception of the infinitely small, and so conforms to the chief condition of motion, absolute continuity, and thereby corrects the inevitable error which the human mind cannot avoid when it deals with separate elements of motion, instead of examining continuous motion. In seeking the laws of historical movement, just the same thing happens. The movement of humanity, arising as it does from innumerable arbitrary human wills, is continuous. To understand the laws of this continuous movement is the aim of history. But to arrive at these laws, resulting from the sum of all these human wills, man's mind postulates arbitrary and disconnected units. The first method of history is to take an arbitrarily selected series of continuous events and examine it apart from others, though there is and can be no beginning to any event, for one event always flows uninterruptedly from another. The second method is to consider the actions of someone, a king or a commander, as equivalent to the sum of many individual wills, whereas the sum of individual wills is never expressed by the activity of a single historic personage. Historical science, in its endeavor to draw nearer to truth, continually takes smaller and smaller units for examination. But however small the units it takes, we feel that to take any unit disconnected from others, or to assume a beginning of any phenomenon, or to say that the will of many men is expressed by the actions of any one historic personage, is in itself false. It needs no critical exertion to reduce utterly to dust any deductions drawn from history. It is merely necessary to select some larger or smaller unit as the subject of observation, as criticism has every right to do, saying that whatever unit history observes must always be arbitrarily selected. Only by taking infinitesimally small units for observation, the differential of history, that is, the individual tendencies of men, and attaining to the art of integrating them, that is, finding the sum of these infinitesimals, we can hope to arrive at the laws of history. The first 15 years of the 19th century in Europe present an extraordinary movement of millions of people. Men leave their customary pursuits, hasten from one side of Europe to the other, plunder and slaughter one another, triumph and are plunged into despair, and for some years the whole course of life is altered and presents an intensive movement which first increases and then slackens. What was the cause of this movement? By what laws was it governed? Asked the mind of man. The historians, replying to this question, lay before us the sayings and doings of a few dozen men in a building in the city of Paris, calling these sayings and doings the Revolution. They then give a detailed biography of Napoleon and of certain people favored or hostile to him, tell of the influence some of these people had on others, and say, that is why this movement took place, and those are its laws. But the mind of man not only refuses to believe this explanation, but plainly says that this method of explanation is fallacious, because in it a weaker phenomenon is taken as the cause of a stronger. The sum of human wills produced the Revolution and Napoleon, and only the sum of those wills first tolerated and then destroyed them. But every time there have been conquests, there have been conquerors. Every time there has been a revolution in any state, there have been great men, says history. And indeed, human reason replies, every time conquerors appear, there have been wars. But this does not prove that the conquerors caused the wars, and that it is possible to find the laws of a war in the personal activity of a single man. Whenever I look at my watch and its hands point to 10, I hear the bells of the neighboring church. But because the bells begin to ring with the hands of the clock reach 10, I have no right to assume that the movement of the bells is caused by the position of the hands of the watch. Whenever I see the movement of a locomotive, I hear the whistle and see the valves opening and wheels turning. But I have no right to conclude that the whistling and the turning of wheels are the cause of the movement of the engine. The peasants say that a cold wind blows in late spring because the oaks are budding. And really every spring cold winds do blow when the oaks are budding. But though I do not know what causes the cold winds to blow when the oak buds unfold, I cannot agree with the peasants that the unfolding of the oak buds is the cause of the cold wind. For the force of the wind is beyond the influence of the buds. I see only a coincidence of occurrences, such as happens with all the phenomena of life, and I see that however much and however carefully I observe the hands of the watch, and the valves and wheels of the engine, and the oak, I shall not discover the cause of the bells ringing, the engine moving, or of the winds of spring. To that I must entirely change my point of view, and study the laws of the movement of steam, of the bells, and of the wind. History must do the same, and attempts in this direction have already been made. To study the laws of history, we must completely change the subject of our observation, must leave aside kings, ministers, and generals, and study the common, infinitesimally small elements by which the masses are moved. No one can say in how far it is possible for man to advance in this way towards an understanding of the laws of history, but it is evident that only along that path does the possibility of discovering the laws of history lie, and that as yet not a millionth part, as much mental effort has been applied in this direction by historians as has been devoted to describing the actions of various kings, commanders, and ministers, and propounding the historian's own reflection concerning these actions. That concludes my reading of chapter 226. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 226. The Calculus of History. History relates only the long, heavy, and confused dream of mankind, according to Schopenhauer. For Stephen Dedalus, it's the nightmare from which he is trying to awake. Professor James Darcy Piaciotto believes it to be a great darkness, filled with echoes from which many voices may reach us, though they be imbued with the obscurity of the matrix of which they come. Clearly, for these men at least, the subject of history is approached with great difficulty. Tolstoy explains why in today's chapter. He begins with Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. The absurdity of this paradox results from arbitrarily dividing continuous motion into discontinuous elements. For Tolstoy, historians engage in the same error when thinking and writing about their subject. This error manifests itself primarily in two ways. First, historians take an arbitrarily selected series of continuous events and examine them apart from all other events. This is silly for Tolstoy because one event necessarily flows from all other events. Secondly, historians err in believing that the actions of one man, typically a military commander or a political leader, are equivalent to the sum of many individual wills. For Tolstoy, this simple arithmetic is too blunt an instrument to make sense of history. History demands instead the integrals of calculus, infinite sums of infinitesimal widths. To study the laws of history, Tolstoy writes, we must completely change the subject of our observation, must leave kings aside, ministers and generals, and study the common, infinitesimally small elements by which the masses are moved. Keep this passage in mind as we move forward in the novel, reading about the lives of the Russians during Napoleon's invasion of their land. For now, however, let's assume Tolstoy is correct that history is the sum of individual units. How then should the individual live in order to ensure that the integrated sum is a positive sum? Daily meditation. Short is life. There is only one fruit in this terrene life, a pious disposition and social acts. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. And that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 226 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for joining me today. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes. Tomorrow we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 227 of War and Peace. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.